us here at the Fairhaven Lecture Series. Today is our last live lecture in the series. This fall, we have been focusing on the election, which is now wrapping up, and there's a little bit more to talk about, which we'll do today. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we have hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series since 1983 over at Fairhaven Senior Services in Whitewater. And like everybody else, this semester we have pivoted and are now offering our lectures online. So if you're joining us live, welcome, and otherwise we will record the lecture. I'm recording the lecture now and we'll post it on our website. So thanks for joining us now or later. If you have questions, we would actually encourage questions. There is a chat box. You can put them in there in the chat box at any time during the lecture, and I will go ahead and go through them at the end of the lecture, and we'll have some time to cover them. But with that, let's go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Louis Fucilla is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at UW-Whitewater. His research focuses on the role of public administration in American democracy, with a particular interest in the causes and consequences of trust in government. He's a recent transplant from Bloomington, Indiana, and is enjoying exploring the many wonderful things Wisconsin life has to offer. Please help me welcome Louis Fucilla.
All right, so let's see if I can share my screen here. Oh, good. Thank you for having me. So I guess I was talking to Carrie when I pitched this idea for a talk. I was like, well, this might be interesting or it might not be. And I think as we were just chatting before this event began, this has turned out to be interesting. And I think that's cool. And I look forward to the questions you have. So I guess I want to frame it this way. So imagine, and I think you could, I've have this kind of lecture that I've given a lot. I've changed the picture here a few times, but just imagine, like, put yourself in this place. Like you've just been elected president, right? And it's a great feeling, I'm sure. But no, there's kind of a catch here. You've been elected. The election is, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. You're not actually going to take office for about 2 months, 11 weeks or so. That inauguration day is in the middle of January. So what are you supposed to do, right? And actually, this is a little shorter than we've had. Is that inauguration day for new presidents used to be in March. And that was the case through the 1930s. And there was actually law moving the start of a president's new term closer to the election, but it's still about 2 months. And so this is a long period of time. Not to worry anybody, but the task a president faces, or their managerial job, and I think we underestimate this part about the presidency, is immense. In 2019, the last federal fiscal year that we have a budget for, revenue, so this is the money government takes in, is $3.5 trillion. Expenditures are $4.4 trillion. And I just to write it out here, because I think we see this number and we're like, a trillion. But this is what this number actually looks like. You see how many zeros are here. It was kind of sad. I did, what my base salary is, right? So just wages. And I'm like, well, how many of me could you buy for $3.5 trillion? And the answer is over 60 million me's, right? You could purchase that many assistant professors of political science with this. So it's a huge amount of money. It's a huge executive responsibility. There are over 100 agencies that are classified as part of the executive branch. So this means that the president has a responsibility for them. If things go wrong, accountability will shift to the president and any mistakes they made. And 100 agencies is kind of a ballpark figure here. The best scholars that study the federal bureaucracy will actually tell you we don't know the true size of the federal executive branch, that it could be in the hundreds. I mean, it could be much bigger than that. So it's a massive executive undertaking. There's no equivalent in the private sector for CEOs. No private sector CEO runs a corporation that spends or takes in that much money. No one presides over a business that is that large and sprawling. And then, just in terms of managing personnel, again, the best estimates are there's about 2.1 federal civilian, 2.1 million federal civilian employees. So it's actually an undercount. That doesn't count uniformed military personnel. That would not count people that are assigned to intelligence agencies. So your personnel responsibility is huge as president. So it's a huge, huge job, massive, right? And if you've won the presidency, guess what? It's now yours. And the question then becomes, what do presidents do? And that transition period, even though it's a gap, presidents are using this period to prepare for their term, particularly if they've been newly elected. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is what's going on in the transition process. What are the phases of this? And then what are the key tasks that are being done? And then where those tasks are, we're seeing some issues this presidential year. So we can talk about that. So the transition period, it actually starts, and I'll say a lot of what we know about presidential transitions come from the work of a nonprofit think tank. It's called the Partnership for Public Service. They're in Washington, D.C., and they've kind of taken it upon themselves to be a source of information about presidential transitions. And they have access to previous administrations' presidential transition plans. So they've had access to material from the George W. Bush administration. They've had access from the Barack Obama administration. They've even had access to planning documents from losing campaigns. So the Romney team, when he ran for president in 2012, had a detailed transition plan. Now, they didn't end up executing most of it, but they did turn it over to the Partnership for Public Service. And, so what we know about presidential transitions comes from this work. Again, just to speak about it, the time of the transition is fairly unique in the American model, or it's unique overall. So the time is unique. When there's a new prime minister in the United Kingdom, their transition into the executive office residence is a matter of days. In Canada, when there's a new, prime minister, transition is about a week. So for us to have a period of about 2 months is unusual for other peers. There's also a lot of staffing that goes on. And I'll talk more about this later, but there's about 4,000 positions that are presidential appointments that need to be staffed. The listing of these, there's actually a document that the government puts out every 4 years called the Plum Book that lists all of these appointee positions and how to be filled, or that have to be filled in an incoming administration. And other advanced industrial democracies do not have as many staffing positions that they have to fill after an election. So they have much smaller number of political appointees that need to be put into office. So we're very unique in our transition period. So let's go into phases, and there's 3 phases that we're going to talk about. The first is the pre-election phase, and so candidates actually start transition planning even before they won a party's nomination. At least the evidence from the plans that we have and that we can do analysis on suggests that candidates start thinking about this in the spring of an election year. So if we're playing along at home, this would put us roughly March, April of this year. And if you go back to that time, March or April, we still don't know who the Democratic nominee is. Biden had been doing well after initially doing poorly, but he hadn't formally secured the nomination. Yet what we know is that candidates are already starting to plan what they're going to do. And at this point, candidates are starting to identify the chairs of their transition team and other key transition personnel. And this is really going to be apart from the campaign, that candidates will have campaign staff that are working on campaign issues. The transition is almost a separate organizational effort, that staff who work in the campaign are not fully part of the transition effort until after the campaign ends. And so think of these as separate administrative endeavors. Another task that's probably already been done is that the campaigns have started to think about names for cabinet positions and other personnel that require Senate confirmation. And what I would say is you haven't started to hear names for the Biden administration or the incoming Biden administration yet. I think that's one of the things we'll expect to see. But internally, there are probably lists that they've already identified a pool of names that they are considering for all of these positions. And right now, they're waiting for some other things, which we'll talk about shortly, to fall into place to start doing the work to vet these personnel. And then lastly, there is some formal things that happen after the party's convention. So after the Democrats or the Republicans hold their convention in a presidential election year, the timeline late July, early August, the candidate for those 2 parties signs an agreement with the General Services Administration, the GSA, and that really marks the start of the formal transition period. Once a nominee is selected by their party, right, then they become the formal candidate of the party. They gain access to transition planning resources. This includes money. It includes office space and email addresses and telephone lines. Essentially, it's a way to allow this other part of the candidates' organizational efforts, the transition team, to have money, to have resources that don't have to be raised through the campaign to work on the candidate's transition plan or the initial elements of this. There's probably also some work to identify policy goals that the candidate or then president-elect will pursue. But a lot of this is identifying the personnel and getting the structure of the organization set up. I would note here at this point, there's no expectation of coordination or agreement between, say, the candidates of both parties, or say, a sitting president and a president or someone trying to knock them off. So the the agreement is signed with the GSA. The GSA is the person that releases funds. President's not expected to do anything for someone running for their office. So I want to be clear. We don't expect, like, we wouldn't expect President Trump before the election to have any role in smoothing a transition for a challenger or helping them in the transition process. Right? He was running for office in his own right, and certainly, under no obligation or no expectation to assist someone who's running for his office. So let's talk about the post-election period. So if you think about it, this is probably from March to Election Day, and then we have the election, right? And this marks probably where most of the activity is going on in the transition. And the key here is that in the law that governs the presidential transition is that a winner has to be ascertained. And that's kind of the technical language that's in the GSA regulations or rules. And so once a winner is ascertained, the law requires the GSA to release transition funds to the winning candidate. And this is a second set of money, and this is a bigger set of money. This, again, goes to pay for personnel and supplies that are needed for the transition. But a key part of this second stage, where government recognizes that we have a president-elect or an incoming president, is that they allow this president-elect's transition to access key resources. And the resources here we're talking about are access to federal agencies, including access to intelligence reports that are prepared by these agencies. And then the other thing is the ability to do government background checks. I've never gone, I can say I've never gone through a government background check, but I certainly have had students that have gone through these checks. And I will tell you, they are, but again, I've never gone through one, but I've been on the other end, and they're a little intimidating, even if I'm not the person applying for the job. Back when I was a doctoral student at IU, I had a student that applied for a job in the Navy, and a civilian position. It was great. I was very excited for the student. But I got an email from someone who's like, hey, I'm, a civilian employee with the Navy. I would like to meet with you and have an interview about this student. And so I had like a half-hour interview with this guy, like wanted to meet in person, couldn't do it over email. The question, blah, 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 the student, you ever known them to harbor anti-American sentiments? Like, no, they were in a public administration class. So I don't know. So these are intense. But a candidate or a president-elect can only access these resources to have them done once the second set of, or the second requirement by the GSA is recognized. And that's one of the things where this is being held up this year. So this is a picture of the administrator or the head of the GSA, who's the person responsible for making this decision that a winner has been ascertained, and has thus far has refused to do so or hasn't done so. And again, this is important. What's going on now is the personnel part of the transition, right? So the Biden team is trying to figure out who appointees are going to be, and conducting these background checks is a vital part of that, because they want to rule folks out that might be controversial or have things in their past, that would rule them out. The other thing, they want to do these background checks not to rule people out, but to identify problems that might come with a nomination. And so, if it's not something that's going to disqualify someone, you want to know what's out there, because it's likely that it'll be brought up during their confirmation hearings. The other two parts of this, and I'll get into more, that are hindered here are agency review that happens, that requires access to agencies. So being able to go in, have the president-elect send teams into the agencies to see what's going on and what he or she might want to do in their term. And then the other thing is policy planning, right? Including the first budget request that a new president has to get out pretty quickly. And again, I'm a little less worried about that. I think in most respects, I think there are a few. In part, it looks like the Biden team, or the team around him, are all folks that have had previous experience in the White House. They're veterans of the Clinton administration. They're veterans of the Obama administration. So I think they'll have a better grip on the policy part. But there is something in terms of policy that, I'm a little concerned about or amiss. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to some of the discussion of these key tasks. And then the last part, the transition actually continues on after Inauguration Day. And this was, again, from the documents of the proposed Romney transition, is that they saw their transition staff actually working through the first congressional recess. And, just as a reference point, that's usually late July, early August of election years. And so it's going to take that long, or it takes that long, to get many of the positions filled in any presidential administration. And so, the folks that are the staff working on the transition probably will be in their positions easily through August, right? So looking at over a year just working on the transition. So let's talk about the tasks. I'll go in and give you some examples of interesting things about all of these. And the one I won't mention is operations. I guess it's just, think of it, this is like its own little startup business. These transition teams, they operate, they come into being, they start small. Think of it as the then candidate is pondering, like, hey, I might win the nomination. I got to start preparing for what if I actually win the election. So it starts small. It might be the domain of just a few staffers at the beginning. It's ramping up now. I bet if you were to look at personnel assigned to the transition now for the Biden administration, it would be at its biggest. They have the most work to do. And slowly they'll tailor off. But you need people to manage the personnel and manage these tasks, right? So who's making sure that background checks get done? Who's making sure that committees working on agency reviews are submitting reports? So there has to be some overall leadership and management of the transition team. That usually falls to the transition chairs or the people immediately under it to do most of this work. So that's a key task. But what we're going to focus on, or where I'll focus on, and then we can get into questions, are these three key tasks: policy planning, agency review, and presidential appointments. So policy planning, right? Presidents are trying to come up, or presidents-elect are trying to come up with the goals they want to accomplish in their first term. So they are looking at promises that were made by the party. So both parties put out platforms. Presidents certainly put out their own campaign promises. So what has the president promised? What are they going to do? And, you know, presidents need this type of, think of it as a roadmap for what you want to accomplish. And a lot of this is getting done early. The budget is also due. So one of a new president's first tasks when they're elected is a budget transmittal or proposal to Congress. That needs to be worked on. Again, I think the Biden team will be less hurt by not. But they have a lot of executive experience, so I think they'll be able to do this fairly well without additional access or information. But this is a big task, and so there are folks that are working on this. And we know that budget is used to drive policy, so the policy proposals that any campaign makes needs to be reflected in the budget as well. So there's to be coordination between these groups. The last thing, and I would say, I guess as someone who has a foot in the management world, presidents also, or some presidents also develop management agendas where they kind of set forth, hey, how do I want to manage the executive branch? And I think most modern presidents have had a management agenda that they've put out and tried to work on. We saw a bit of a break from that in the Trump administration. I mean, they had one. I don't think they did much with it. But it'll be interesting to see. One of the things I'll be looking at is does a President Biden actually have some idea for how they want to, want the federal government to work, right, at the managerial level, and are they going to propose that? One of the interesting things I think you've seen thus far from the transition, and one of the few visible things, what's one of the first things that they did? Well, they had that COVID working group last week, right? So it's pretty clear that, my guess is that the Biden administration or incoming administration sees COVID as the key policy task that it's worried about. And that's what they're going to focus on. So a lot of this policy work is centered around COVID. And, one of the interesting things here, as much as folks have criticized President Trump and his response to COVID, the options for a president to take are really limited. And I think we've seen the limits of what a president can do or what they can ponder doing. So when during the campaign, there was a lot of talk. I know my students were worried about it. So this usually means it's getting around if they know about it. That, they're like, well, Biden wants a national mask mandate. I'm like, well, might want that, but I don't think he can really do it. And, in part, public health is a policy area or a domain of the states, and presidents have little authority in that area. And so, what a president can do on this is going to be exceptionally limited. And as my students and I have talked about it the last week, I said the difference here is really going to be symbolic more than substantive on policy. And, my question to them and, my question to everyone is, is that important? Is it important to have an executive that shows that they're taking COVID seriously and, trying to do stuff about it, or is that just a meaningless distinction? And I think they were kind of split on that. But I think that's a question for us to ponder, right? Because there are going to be real limits to what any president can do. So policy planning. The other thing, and you always see this, and I'm sure I could reach back for any presidency in recent history, but on Inauguration Day, more often than not, you will see a president signing something in the Oval Office. And you might say to yourself, what the heck are they signing? Congress hasn't been in session that long. Usually they haven't worked through I think Congress starts about 10 days before the new Congress is seated, about 10 days before the inauguration. I mean, very rarely, I can't think of an example in my lifetime, that they're going to get legislation passed in 10 days. And so you might say, what the heck's the president signing? And what he's signing are executive orders. And so this is part of what's going on, is that policy planning team is coming up with stuff a president can do on day one of their presidency. And this is early on in the Trump presidency. I'll just kind of note him because he's an alum of my department. So that's Ryan Priebus. He was one of the first chiefs of staff for President Trump. He is an alumni of the Department of Political Science at the University of Whitewater. And he was my great answer for, what can you do with a political science degree at the University of Whitewater? And while he was there, I could say, you could be chief of staff to the President of the United States. But it, didn't last through the end of the Trump administration. But, again, you can tell this is an early photo because he was in there. And, what we've seen is that increasingly presidents are reliant on using executive orders to take action quickly in their terms. And this is only possible because their transition team is preparing this for them. And so again, here's a chart. This is also from the Partnership from Public Service. So, here's the days in office and how many executive action that have been taken. And so, on day one, Trump signed 2 executive orders. On 10 days, he had issued 18 more, right? So there's, presidents are increasingly using this as kind of a running start into their term. And if I had an educated guess, I would bet you one of Biden's first executive orders will be overturning the Mexico City policy. This is something that's also known as the global gag rule. And it's an executive order that has been, I guess the right words, think of it's like a light switch, right? It's turned on and then turned off. And it's been being turned on and off since I think the George H.W. Bush presidency. Again, goes back to 89 to 93. And what it means is that when the rule is in effect, which it is for Republican presidents, foreign aid money given out by the State Department cannot go to organizations that refer clients to providers of abortion services, right? So not that these organizations provide abortions themselves, they can't even refer people out. So this executive order is on during Republican presidential administrations, gets turned off by Democratic administrations. And we've just seen this go, again, like a light switch between Republicans and Democrats. So I would expect this will be one of his first to do that, and other things. And I think what we're witnessing in the presidency, I'll say this apart from stuff about the transition, is that we're seeing an increasingly executive-centric system of governance where presidents move stuff not necessarily by winning support in Congress and getting laws made, but by taking executive action. So part of this, and they do this to get off to a running start. So agency review, right? And this is a part that I think gets very little attention, in part because it's boring. But every transition will send a team out to go into those federal agencies. And this is all the federal agencies that are part of the executive branch. So you can imagine there are a lot of these little teams. And they're called landing teams. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's the terminology the partnership uses, that they go into agencies, they interview personnel. And by that, I mean, they interview careerists within the agency, and they just try to get information about what's going on, right? So what's the mission of the department or the agency? For those of us that study bureaucracy, statutory authority. So what's the agency's or department's legal basis or that it's using to run its program? What are its budgets? And what are the management challenges that the agency is facing? And the goal here is to provide briefing books for appointees to this agency. And there's an interesting case study that emerged from Barack Obama's transition. And so I think all of you are familiar with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This was a oil rig out in the Gulf of Mexico that had an accident, an explosion, loss of life, and a massive oil spill in the Gulf. What's known is that so the agency responsible for oversight of oil rigs was the then Minerals Management Service, which was in the Department of Transportation. And the transition team identified that there were problems in that agency during the Obama transition, so late 2008, early 2009. They knew there were issues where agency people in charge of regulating oil rigs were being bribed by the companies to not fully regulate for health and safety. So they had identified this problem. One of the issues, though, is that this was not a key priority for the Obama administration. If you can go back to that time, what's going on when the Deepwater Horizon accident occurs, that the Democrats and the Obama administration are trying to pass healthcare. That was their big priority at the start of Obama's term. He was going to do healthcare, and things like this were going to be stuff that got dealt with later. Well, that got dealt with later, right? The worst case happened. We had an accident. Now, would it have been prevented? Maybe not. I mean, I don't know. That's kind of a historical counterfactual. But we do know the administration was aware of this, and it just was not the priority to deal with it. So this review is an important thing. The other part is dealing with careerists that so when I said, look, there are 2.1 or about 2.1 million federal civilian employees, that's what I mean by careerists. There are a heck of a lot of them. Their tenure in office is a really long time. And I'll just throw Anthony Fauci out here. I mean, I usually bureaucrats are faceless, and that's fine. But he's a good example because, one, we know who he is now, just because of events. But, he's an interesting dude in the sense that he's been in his position since 1984. depending on when that was in 1984, I was 6. So he's been there a long time. He served under multiple presidents. And right, this is the base of career civil servants. They didn't get their job through knowing people in politics. They got their job because they're competent to do what they were hired to do. And a long-running tension, at least this goes to Nixon and his assumption of the presidency in '68, is that presidents have been concerned about careerists. For the Nixon administration, it was, Democrats have controlled the presidency for so long, we're worried that political appointees are not going to listen to a Republican president. And so, there's naturally some antagonism in the relationship. But folks that have studied transition, scholars and practitioners alike, have said that presidents who transition successfully are able to engage careerists the best. That, they're the ones that are able to go out and, forge working relationships with the careerists in the agencies, so that the careerists don't face that resistance. And I try to tell my students, I'll tell you guys as well, is that the tweets or what comments from President Trump about the deep state are really not anything new in this respect. That there's been a concern for a long time, particularly among Republican presidents or Republicans elected as presidents, about the impact of working with civil servants. So appointments. Appointments are designed to enhance presidential control. The idea is that the president gets to place a few of their people in key positions. And the ones we really focus on are about these 1,200 presidential appointments with Senate confirmation. These tend to get the most spotlight and attention. Generally, the cabinet level appointments are the ones we're talking about here. But note that, about about three quarters of the remaining appointments are stuff that don't require Senate confirmation. And generally, we don't see or hear about these people very much, but it's a pretty big administrative haul to get these positions in. We do have some concern about the thickening of bureaucracy with the number of political appointees, that we've actually seen this increase over time. And there's been some concern over a recent Trump executive order that actually would have increased this number. He proposed creating a new personnel title for the federal government that would have been a Schedule F, and these would have also been political appointments. And this would have been a lot of people, but I think that's not going to happen now. The last thing I'll say is that, or some appointments, that the president's involvement is going to vary here, that they're usually most involved in picking key personnel, and that a lot of the time they, for those lower positions that we're talking about, the ones that don't require Senate confirmation, a president's going to delegate who they trust to make these personnel decisions. So where they're most involved are cabinet secretaries, those key deputies in those cabinet departments, and then White House staff and personnel. We've seen this process become really contentious, that I think in presidents past, most times the president got their pick of cabinet. We've seen substantially a higher rate of political conflict over appointees, particularly in the Trump administration. So I would expect this to continue into a Biden administration, particularly if the Senate is controlled by Republicans. So expect this to be somewhat contentious. And then, I guess this is the last thing I'll say about appointments, is that how an administration starts out here is matters. And one of the criticisms of the Trump administration, not on policy grounds, but purely on administrative or management grounds, is that they were slow with their appointments, and they've never been exceptionally good at managing them. And we've seen this actually, and I'll point you to this news story that the acting Secretary of DHS, Chad Wolf, issued an order to suspend the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Chad Wolf's action was overturned by a judge who said he's been illegally appointed. And so the Trump administration being slow on appointments at the start of their term has had these ripple effects even 4 years later, where they faced, once the president removes the acting secretary, who they can put in that place is limited by law. And we've seen this now where judges are starting to say this is an illegal appointment. You have no authority to issue policy. And again, it goes back to being slow at the start of their transition to getting these nominations made. So just a few things, what to expect now. So for policy, it matters what happens in Georgia. I think, we're just going to have to see. I think the Biden administration is going to focus on COVID and distribution of a vaccine. But beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. I don't think policy here is going to be as affected by the issues with the transition. The one exception here would be national security. Again, once a winner is recognized, a president-elect is recognized, they are now given access to the presidential daily briefing. This gives them a sense of the current threats against the nation, as well as military and security operations that are underway. Now, this type of information is vital, right, for a president-elect planning with respect to national security and military, and that's not happening right now. For agency review, again, this is impacted. We have not had the GSA recognize that Joe Biden is the president-elect, and that means that this part isn't happening, and it will not happen until they're formally recognized as the president-elect. And, just as a timing thing, and everyone here has worked, everyone knows what organizational life is like. Things really slow down during the holidays. So this is the time that these transition staff can get in, access agency personnel, and prepare their reports. If this goes on too much longer, personnel are going to be on break, right, for the holidays. It may be harder to do this type of work and prepare reports for incoming appointees. Again, I will say that for the appointment process, we're starting to see some stuff. So we've seen the COVID task force named. We've seen the chief of staff named. That's Ron Klain, who's a veteran of several presidential administrations. Just expect to start hearing names just as being floated up for cabinet positions. And just, in case anyone's really worried or, is hoping for a reunion of Obama and Biden. Just, I think Obama had an interview last night, and he said that Michelle's nixed him joining Biden's cabinet. I believe he said she'll leave me if I go back into politics. So he's out as a candidate. And again, the personnel action is going to be delayed here because background checks can't be done. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I certainly hope we're able to do this again in person soon. And what questions do you have? I want to turn it over and just answer what's on your mind about the transitions.
Thank you so much. That answered a lot of questions I think that people are having. I will remind people that we have a chat box there in the lower right. If you'll go ahead and put your questions there, I can read them off. We have a few questions that were put in the chat throughout the lecture. I think some of them have been answered, but maybe we'll kind of go over a couple that you could refresh us on. One of them early on, you were talking about when the election results were ascertained. Can you define ascertained, and where is that specified? Is that in a statute or something?
Yeah, so I think it's in, and I'm going to be a little off on that, or I might be a little off. So it's an act of Congress. I think it's the Presidential Transition Act, and it might have the Presidential Moderate Transition Modernization Act is the most recent one, and that sets out the process of how the GSA is supposed to contract with candidates once they're a party's nominee, and it also sets out what they do to recognize when the winner is called. And the terminology there is vague. So that's one of the questions. What does it mean to ascertain the election? And I think where the Trump administration is taking this is they say, well, ascertain means when results are certified by the states. Past presidents have usually taken that to mean when a winner is declared by the media or media organizations. So I'm sure the language of the statute doesn't help us here on that.
Yeah. So this question, I'm not exactly sure what's being asked, but I'll try. Is there a difference in the power of an executive order versus a law?
Yeah. So, great. This is my students and I are working on this, so this is great. And they always have this question too. Yeah. So executive orders have the same effect as law. So when a president issues them, they do have that impact. But here's how they're limited. So first, Congress can overturn an executive order by passing a law. Obviously, this is only going to happen when Congress is of a different party than the president. Congress is controlled by the president's party. No one is going to slap their own president's hand, if that makes sense, right? They're going to not be hard on their own president. If I'm saying that correctly. So that remedy will only work when there's a divided Congress and it's controlled by the other party. But mostly, how do presidents' executive orders get overturned? There's a new president in that overturns them, right? So they can be overturned by the next president. And again, the classic example is that Mexico City policy. It's just a light switch. It's on for Republicans, off for Democrats. On, off, on, off. And so some of them are just like that.
So how about when an incumbent president is reelected? Is there any transition process at all? Or, what about the funds that are set aside for that, or the role of the GSA? Is that even exist if the person is reelected?
I would have to explore. That's a good question. I would have to explore that a little bit more. So what we do know is that certainly there's been discussion, or for an incumbent president who wins re-election, there's always discussion about personnel changes that want to be made. And usually those are set before an election. So usually people have resigned, at least privately to the president. They've said, I'll be stepping down after the election. I'm giving you a chance to start now filling my position. So that usually does happen when a president gets another term. Now, in terms of the GSA funding of that I'm less sure about, in part because the president enjoys the advantage of already controlling the office and having, once the president is office, one of the offices in the White House, or I guess the executive office of the president, as we call it, the administrative title, they do have their own personnel office in there. And so some of the appointments would transition naturally from a transition team managing them to the White House personnel office doing that. So once the transition wound down, it would move over to this new group, this different grouping. So there's stuff going on. It's certainly not as busy or as active as for an incoming president.
So back to the executive order versus law question. Can Congress just end an executive order other than by law, or is there a way to end an executive order, other than another executive order?
So again, Congress can pass law. I guess I should say they can be challenged in court. So a good example of this is later in his second term, Obama issued an executive order to stop deportation of people in the country illegally unless they had other offenses, right? Other violent offenses. So he said, look, if Customs and Border Patrol picks up someone or police pick up someone, it's like on a driving charge, right? Just speeding or drunk and disorderly. I would have to check about the drunk part. But I mean, for any minor infraction, they said don't deport people. And this was challenged by House Republicans at the time. And the Supreme Court sided with them. And it said the president cannot issue an executive order that specifically contravenes established law. But the issue is that there's lots of gray area within law. So presidents have lots of leverage to go in and say how that law is going to be interpreted. So there are some limitations and there are ways to undo them, but they're very hard, I guess is what I would say.
So I'll give folks just another minute if you want to enter any questions. And in the meantime, I'll finish with this question, and that is, if you could, do you have any guesses of when the GSA might acknowledge and turn over the resources to the Biden administration? Or if it doesn't happen, I guess worst case scenario, they get those resources January 20th, right? Or what do you foresee happening?
So I thought there would be some movement. I think last week you saw, oh goodness, I'm going to blank on his name. But a Republican senator come out and say, look, we need to get this going. And it was, I'm blanking on who it was.
From Oklahoma?
Yes. It's not Tom Cotton. I'm just blanking on his name.
No,
I'm thinking
I
of Tom.
see his face too, but I can't think of his name. But yeah,
I'm thinking of Tom Coburn, and he's not in the Senate anymore, but he was from Oklahoma. So, yeah, he'd come out and said, I think we need to recognize this and move on. I guess the closest reference would be the 2000 election, and there, because it was disputed so long. So actually, the Modernization Act happened after that, in recognition that was a really weird transition. But the Bush administration basically had to kind of work around. So I think they had retreats back in the day where they, and they asked candidates to disclose information. So instead of relying on a government background check, like, just please tell us truthfully right? Reveal to us information that might cause us to question your appointment. So they can work around it. Would it be great? No, but we'll just have to see how long it goes. I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, there's not a lot of history we can rely on for examples in this particular case. So I think with that, we'll close things down. And I just want to say thank you, Louis, for this excellent lecture. It would be nice to revisit it again in a month, because it seems like a lot could still happen during this time of transition, and could be quite unpredictable.
Yes. Who knows?
Who knows? Thank you again for joining us. Thanks, everyone in the
Thanks for
audience.
having me. And thanks for people in the audience or who will attend.